Hi, everyone. Welcome to our weekly podcast, Retail Unwrapped. I'm very excited during Earth Month to have two provocative guests with me today. I have Anne Cantrell, who is a professor from Fashion Institute of Technology. She's written courses on sustainability. She teaches sustainability and circularity. She's also an owner and founder of Annie's Blue Ribbon Store, a fantastic fun store in Brooklyn, New York. And also, Anne, you are an advocate for small businesses.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Liz Alessi, and you are a consultant extraordinaire. You do a lot of work in sustainability, circularity. You also have a background at a major retailer, manufacturer, coach, and tapestry. So you bring a world of experience and expertise to our podcast today. And I understand you're actually doing a keynote at Fashion Institute of Technology, which is fantastic. So welcome.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me, Shelley. And I'm really pleased to be here with my dear, dear friend, Anne.
That's
Shelley,
excellent.
Liz also has a daughter the same age as mine, so they both keep us in check on many levels.
I don't know. Mine doesn't even turn her lights off, so I don't think she's not a role model.
It is funny. And my son does I have two sons and one son is like always reminding me of things. So I think it's great, this younger generation. But let's start our conversation today. We're talking about circularity, the state of the fashion industry. There's so much going on. Let's start with, what does the state of the fashion industry look like? Liz, maybe you can kick us off.
Oh my gosh, it's such a very interesting week to be having this question on a podcast, actually, right? I mean, I think the state of the fashion industry is in a major disruption at the moment. I think that, obviously with supply chains all around the world, and the tariffs, it's like a very confusing time. So it's, unfortunately not the best moment in time, but I think that in moments like this, we have the ability to make some pretty dramatic changes that hopefully will be better in the longer term. But I think I'd love to hear Anne's answer to that one.
Yes, well, you're so right. We're in this huge paradigm shift right now, I think. But in terms of Earth Month and why we're here today talking about sustainability, I will just say that on one hand, we are really dealing with so much in the retail world. But for the first time, I was reading in Retail Wire that resale sales outpaced retail in 2024, really fueled by a budget conscious shopper looking at sustainability, but also thinking about this uncertain economic environment and, less disposable and discretionary income. And fast fashion is getting faster than ever. We saw recently that Forever 21 closed finally after years of figuring out their bankruptcy situation. But really, there was an interesting New York Times article about this on March 30th about that we are really in this time of almost instant fashion. And because of brands like Shein and Temu that are driving things quicker and faster than ever before, it's really, even a Forever 21 couldn't keep up. So in class, I'm always telling my students that my slides are trash because I'm always showing how much we are throwing away into landfills and how, just so the audience knows, we should never be throwing away our clothes. We should always try to donate them. That's a whole different conversation about where our clothes go from that perspective, but at least trying to keep them in the cycle as much as possible. We recycle them. Places can downcycle them. You might even find a hauler that it's going to take away some scraps. In Brooklyn, where Liz and I both live, we put things on the stoop and they get taken immediately, which is really
Yeah.
fun. Yes, I've gotten some good finds on the stoop. But and now more than ever, students, like back to the earlier part, are really like selling their goods. We have students that have Depop shops, and it's actually really exciting from that perspective. But I do want to talk and make sure that the audience knows how much fast fashion is killing our environment. All the pollution and textile waste is contributing to climate change and resource depletion. Oh, just for some more context, the fashion industry uses so much water. To make a t-shirt takes 2,700 liters of water. That's about 700 gallons. That's
Beautiful.
enough to live off for 3 years. And how many t-shirts do we all have in our closet, right? And ironically, women and girls around the world are the ones that are spending a majority of time getting that water resources for their family. We're really lucky and blessed here in the United States, but that we can open our faucet and get clean, fresh water most of the time. But the fashion industry is a major contributor to climate change. It's responsible for 10% of global carbon emissions. Synthetic fabrics like polyester that are made from fossil fuels, we're really, hitting it on both sides, exacerbating the problem. And less than 1%, I'm sure Liz can talk about this later, but less than 1% of material used to produce clothing is made from recycled into new clothing. So we really just have this massive material loss. The landfill, the clothing in textiles and landfills cause carbon dioxide, methane, which are greenhouse gas emissions. We're also, if everybody knows, we're eating about a credit card's worth of plastic each week from microplastics that get into our laundry everywhere. Antarctica, breast milk, all have microplastics. So really, just one more quick point to say how massive the industry is. The fashion industry has like 430 million people in it, and between the fashion and textile industry. So the aspect, and that's like about almost 12% of the global workforce. So, and most of these people aren't earning a living wage. We're not paying them enough money. And so it really, all these factors, environmental, ethical, all of these factors are really coming together to cross a very tumultuous time, not to mention a very complex supply chain that is, really, as Liz mentioned, with tariffs and companies trying to play like whack-a-mole to figure out where they should produce things. Actually, there was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal about that, talking about Lululemon and Nike, about how they they've moved so much production there, and now they're getting hit with tariffs as well. So that combined with overconsumption, we're just in a really, really tough spot right now.
So let me ask you a question. So first of all, I've always admired your passion. Our listeners can hear it. They can see your passion. And I just really admire the work that you're doing. I feel like the work that you're doing is really making a difference. But let me ask you a question. So I feel like we've worked so hard over the past decade, even the last 20 years, but specifically the last decade, we've worked so hard to get to a point where we are making a difference. And now there's a lot of rollbacks. There's a rollbacks on environmental. There's rollbacks on other initiatives. Can you talk a little bit about, going backwards just seems like the wrong thing to do.
I know. I'm sure Liz can chime in here too. I'll just get us started. But really, I feel like we were going in a good direction pre-COVID, and then COVID actually highlighted a lot of things. Maybe your listeners are familiar with the hashtag payout movement, where Remake really got a big social media movement to make sure that brands were paying the due costs to the vendors that had already paid for things. So we had some clarity around the supply chain during COVID, and we had a chance to rebuild things. It didn't really catch on. Brands are, obviously we are still in a profitability mindset. And I just want to say, as a store owner, I wholeheartedly believe in environmental sustainability as well as economic sustainability. We have to be able to pay our bills in order for this all to work together. So it's been very upsetting in this current context of business and policy, where brands are also trying to, cover their bases and meet their margins. But we're seeing a pretty intense rollback of environmental regulations at the federal level. Everything from EPA enforcement powers being weakened by climate policies being stalled, and of course DEI as well. A big, point of discussion a few years ago was ESG, environmental, social, and governance initiatives. And these are often the first to roll back. So we're really at this crossroads where we have a lot more awareness from consumers, especially the younger generations, as we were talking about earlier. And we want brands to be more transparent and responsible, but politically and economically, the headwinds are real, and it's going to be an interesting, I always tell my students, we're living through it right now. We'll see how things play out.
Yeah, so true. And there are some bright spots like SB 707 in California. So like as Anne said, at the federal level, things might be rolling back, but the states do still have the power to do things like that. And SB 707 is the first in the US extended producer responsibility. So brands actually have to take responsibility for the products that they make even after they're sold to the consumer and the consumer doesn't want them anymore. So I think that's really interesting. And I also wonder if there's a silver lining to these tariffs where, if people have less discretionary income, maybe they will be actually buying less. And that could be interesting, looking at resale, looking at vintage, looking at upcycling. And there are some brands that are doing really interesting things. Like my favorite project that I've worked on from a product standpoint was actually with my alma mater coach, where I worked for a very long time.
And
which
met
was
me, by the way.
that was actually my favorite part, was
Side
meeting
benefit,
Anne.
meeting Anne.
That's right. But she was talking about like the amount of water that it takes to make fabrics around the world, and we did this really scaled project where we used denim that came from Salvation Army and Goodwill. It was actually post-consumer denim to make Coach bags, and this was like really scaled in the tens of thousands of units. And they actually sponsored an LCA, a life cycle analysis. And it proved that there's over 90% carbon savings and over 80%, over 80% carbon savings and over 90% water savings by using existing materials.
That's
Well,
great.
that's
And Liz,
talking about making the business case for sustainability, which is like really how we're going to win on this in this conversation.
absolutely. And Liz, can you just go back for our listeners, explain what the SB 707 is in layman terms?
Yeah, sure. So basically what it is in California, if a brand selling product to people in California, then that the consumer doesn't want the product at the end of the product's life, the brand is financially responsible for dealing with the product in some responsible way. So they're actually creating in California what's called a PRO. It'll be a nonprofit organization that brands have to pay into, and then the PRO will help to figure out what California needs to do as a state in order to handle the end of life of these products, because it's a huge issue.
That is a tremendous impact.
It's going to take a few years to get set up, but it's going, at least it's headed in the right direction.
I think that's unbelievable.
Yeah. And the idea with these things is, if it's in one state, then, as we've seen with like automobile industry, for example, things, are hopefully going to roll out to other states as well. But the European Union, maybe, Liz, you can just tell us a few things what the EU has been doing, maybe with the digital product passport as well, because I think that would be really, those are some amazing rollouts that they've been doing.
Yeah, I think the digital product passport, which is like DPP, they call it, is really interesting because it's requiring brands to have radical transparency about what is in the product that consumers are buying. Where did the material come from? Where was it manufactured? All kinds of information that most consumers don't have access to today. So it's requiring brands to actually then take responsibility for their supply chain in order to then report on the supply chain. In addition to the fact that it's very helpful for, again, end of life of products. So you can actually scan products with DPPs now and you understand the content of it. So therefore you understand what you can do with it. Can you recycle it here? Does it need to be disassembled, etc.? So it's DPPs are excellent.
Yeah. And I want to go back to something, Anne, you said, because I think it's very relevant. And doing a lot of circularity and sustainability in a business, it's costly, it's difficult, it's complex. Becoming a B Corp certified, that's very difficult road to take. And you're right, Anne, the P&L has to work. You have to still make money. You have to be profitable. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about, what brands are doing it right, what brands are making it work and being able to still make a profit at the end of the day.
Yes. Well, that's a complex conversation, but I do want to say that, just everything, some brands might be doing something really good here, and I'll tell you about a few of those, but I do want to mention what Kering's environmental profit and loss statement, which they share on their website and have shared out, and even have spoken at FIT in the past about it as well. But that way of analyzing decision making to, not just from the bottom line. We look to businesses for the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profitability. And often I also correct my students and say, let's just maybe not think of it as profitability for, the head of the top of the pyramid, the C-suite, but also maybe prosperity for everybody in the supply chain. So really looking at it from a more holistic supply chain perspective. So when you talk about some of these brands, in class, we obviously highlight brands like Patagonia. That's kind of like me winning on all of these fronts. They're doing amazing things environmentally. They're really very transparent. You can, use a QR code to analyze and look at their supply chain. They're really trying to share information. They helped start the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, now Cascale, but in general, really winning on all those different fronts. Stella McCartney, a luxury brand, but really, really one true core values that is, trickles down to the rest of the industry. I just wrote and presented a paper at the London College of Fashion about this new concept that I've been talking about called slow fashion. And I brought up some smaller brands there, like Cotton, KOTN, which is out of Canada, that produces in Egyptian Delta. And they really started with this idea of trying to find the best t-shirt. But they are like one of the top ranked apparel B Corps in North America. The Kit is a really interesting one out of Dominican Republic that is producing bespoke clothing within a 10 or 20 day time frame specifically for you. So they're not keeping any inventory. You can choose from their styling. They develop and print and cut, make, and trim everything under their one roof. So the transportation costs are low as well. And they're, like I said, not producing anything until it's sold. I also talked about one brand that it was really big when I was in high school, CP Shades. They have been producing in Sausalito, California for the past 40 years, but they really only cut to order what they are getting. I mentioned Reformation. They, have some, there's some takers and detractors on all of these sides. But Liz, do you have any more to add to that?
I mean, I really have always really respected Eileen Fisher in general. She's like the OG of the extended producer responsibility, actually. And I think Coach is doing a wonderful job as well in terms of like really upcycling at scale, and the Reloved program, which is actually something that I helped launch early in its early days, which basically took bags that came into the repair shop and brought designers in to sort of redesign them, give it a little aesthetic love, and then resell the product on their website. So they're extending the life of the product. So any brand that's offering repair service, I think, is really interesting. Tailoring, I think, is really interesting. And you're never going to talk a CFO into like making less money next year. So I do think that triple bottom line that Anne mentioned is extremely important. And a lot of people that are in fashion sustainability can get lost in like the rainbows and unicorns about all of this, but we really have to think about profit in terms of like even the reduction of fabric use, for example, like zero waste design or designing for circularity. These are all things that have financial impacts on the front end and the back end. And we really need to look at the entire supply chain and the entire lifespan of the product in order to understand the P&L, the total P&L, the true cost of what we're actually making and using.
Yeah, I just want to jump on one thing. Liz mentioned Eileen Fisher and like CP Shades also, their products work with each other season after season. So they're this kind of classic timeless look. So we haven't really even talked about trends and how this factors into the conversation. But certainly, when people are wearing things only a couple times, and then, moving on to something next. And that's why Shein and Temu are just like crushing it, sadly, and crushing the environment in the process by, just producing what the next thing that someone wants to wear just like that night or that weekend. And so some of these brands, again, if you think about sustainability in a different perspective, and not, of course, we want our environmentally produced and preferred materials. We want ethical manufacturing and sourcing, but we also want things that are going to last a long time and that people really feel good in and feel good on your body. So, your listeners can also think about it from that perspective too, that, if you
Right.
buy something, it's going to last a really long time. That is really important as well.
I have to share with you my kind of how I tackle trends. I just buy something and it sits in my closet for 20 years, and I know trends are cyclical and they all come back. So I just go back and I go reshopping in my closet. I say, okay, this
Yes.
is trendy. I can wear it again.
Oh, yes. One of my best friends from Ralph Lauren, he always looks so good. And I'm like, what are you wearing? He's like, my closet. And I love that. I do want to say
Yeah.
for your listeners, if they want to check out Good on You, they have some really good suggestions and review brands. They have a great newsletter as well. But they can also look for accountability and transparency reports from Fashion Revolution and Remake and others, Business of Fashion, et cetera, that can help with that to help analyze and
Right.
look at brands.
And yeah, can you just explain the flow fashion? Because I think it's a great concept, and I know that's gaining a lot of traction. So tell us what
Well,
that is.
yeah, so I hope so. It's the idea. It's the idea of reframing what fast fashion means. Fast fashion doesn't have to be a dirty word. Of course it is, and that's how we've come to terms with it. But CP Shades is an example of a brand that's doing fast fashion, but in a sustainable way. So flow fashion is this concept that I came up with, which is combining the best business practices of fast fashion with the core values of slow fashion. Slow fashion, if your listeners aren't aware, it's kind of like, I always like to talk about fast food versus slow food movement, right? Fast food, we know that's McDonald's. It's, we're heating up food and eating it quickly. And but in slow food movement, we have farmers markets. We might know the chef. We are familiar with materials. So it's the same thing with clothing. So this idea of when you are in a flow state, which I feel right now on this podcast, where mind and body are at one and we're aligned with, working towards a good goal. This idea of combining the best business practices of fast fashion with the core values of slow fashion.
I love
No,
it.
that's great. And so before we leave, is there any advice you have? I mean, we've covered a ton of topics right here, and you mentioned a lot of different things that brands can do and think about. What advice would you give the retailers and brands that are out there today? Where do you start? What do you do? How do you focus?
I'll let Liz take this one over as the business guru consultant she is.
Well, I really think that brands need to start looking across their entire value chain. So sustainability isn't a standalone business unit, let's say. You have to think about sustainability in your finances, in your merchandising team, in your design team, even in your DCs. Like, it's something that has to be an underlying core value. And I also think that, the NYU Rosie work has been really interesting, which is, return on sustainable investment. It's worth listeners checking that out as well. Brands need to start thinking more long term instead of short term. So there is going to be risk mitigation that they can do today. They can be first movers on new technologies that are actually going to save them money in the long term. So my advice would be to really look more long term. There's also interesting financial triggers that brands can implement, like a very small tax on any new product that is sold that then goes into like an ESG kitty, for example, that can then help fund some of these new technologies that might cost a little more at the beginning, just like as Anne was saying, like organic food costs a lot more at the beginning of the organic food movement, and the cost comes down over time. So in order to fund and get some of these like recycled fibers, for example, like off the ground, that's one financial trigger that can be implemented to get it going.
That's great. And any advice?
Yeah, I think first finding a baseline and where they're at right now and being able to measure from there. I love the business phrase, what gets measured gets managed, right? If we don't know where we are, we don't know how we're going to improve. So and being real with themselves and their consumers and saying that their work in progress. I think Liz taught me a really important word a couple of years ago, green hushing. We might know what green washing is when we're using more of our marketing dollars to make something look sustainable than it is. But then we've had this backlash where brands don't want to share any information for fear of like getting in trouble with the consumer and other aspects. So, it's a process, and it's also fashion industry is a very complex system that has been working this way for a long time. So brands don't own their own factories on the majority of the time. So really, just looking at holistic approach and coming up with a baseline and trying to work forward from there.
That's great. Well, Liz and Anne, thank you so much. You both are so inspirational. Thanks for joining us today. I'm sure our listeners learned a ton.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks.